Well, I'm delighted to be here today with Bob Howarth, who is a veteran journalist with a long background through newspapers as an editorial manager at Queensland newspapers, through to being managing director at the Post Courier in Papua New Guinea. He set up the Timor Post newspaper, and for our purposes today, most importantly for us, he's doing a lot of work in the Pacific area in media freedom. And he is the Reporters Without Borders, RSF correspondent for Papua New Guinea, East Timor and the Solomon Islands. So welcome, Bob.
Good to be here.
Yeah.
Welcome to you.
Can you tell us a little bit about the RSF work that you do for those countries and how that Reporters Without Borders process works?
Well, it's basically monitoring any attacks on press freedom, like attacks on journalists, on new legislation that's going to hamper press freedom, which is a very real threat in both Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste, especially in Timor-Leste, East Timor now, with the proposal to pass a law to license journalists and also exclude foreigners from working as journalists in East Timor.
Well, that's a serious concern, and it's something that does arise in some countries more than others, and particularly I think Timor-Leste is one of the newest countries in the world as a nation, and so when they're fragile and new in a democracy, you do get these media freedom issues arising.
Yes, and when you've got a young sort of politicians who've only for 14 years now they've been independent, and there's a reaction everywhere in the world with the young politicians to blame the media if there's a bad report or a bad image of that country or politics in the country. And this has happened both in Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste.
Well, RSF is an international organisation based out of Paris, and it's dealing with media freedom issues internationally every day. Now, how does Australia compare with these neighbouring countries, Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands, as far as media freedom goes?
Well, both countries look to Australia to provide a guide to the way the media should be able to report and operate. I've found that even they look more to Indonesia, which has, I think, an even freer press than Australia does at the moment. Wild and woolly press, you know, it's a bit of the Wild West in Indonesia at times, but I'm just absolutely amazed by what they can do. It's dangerous. And I've been saying quite often to the Timorese, look to next door rather than down south for your idea of how you should be operating freely.
Well, as all of these things are comparative, I suppose. We're on a scale of media freedom. Australia isn't perfect, but it does come from that Western liberal tradition, and so our laws impact on journalists in one way, whereas they're less likely to be jailed or fined for what they do.
Yes, yeah, and that's a real threat in both these countries. Where and one of the problems, of course, is journalists' training and education in both countries. Where in Timor-Leste, the university is using a course from Brazil, which bears no resemblance really, apart from the fact they're speaking Portuguese for Timor-Leste.
Now, you've been involved at a range of levels, not just with your RSF work, and you've been involved in an Indonesian university with the Institute for Freedom and Democracy in Bali.
Yes.
Can you tell us just a little bit about those two?
Yeah,
projects?
well, I've taught two courses at Pajajaran University in Bandung in West Java, in their journalism school, which is rated as one of the best in Indonesia. And I've been working, I think I've spent 8 months of the last 16 months in Bali, working at the Institute for Peace and Democracy, which has engaged Egypt, Tunisia, Myanmar and Fiji to show them how Indonesia went from a military dictatorship virtually to a full democracy, and all the lessons learned in that change from a military government to a free and open democratic society. And I'm going back for the elections on the 9th of April to play sheepdog basically to a large contingent of Myanmar Burmese people who are coming to observe the election. Somebody said it was they're going to watch how to run an election without anybody getting shot.
Now, newspapers, media, has obviously been your lifelong passion.
Yes.
But I've noticed, I've admired over recent decades your development ethos and your humanitarian angle on media. So can you just tell us a little bit about your initiation of Braille newspapers, newspapers for the blind in a couple of countries, and also your work with the establishment of the Timor Post newspaper. These are both just massive humanitarian efforts.
Yeah, well, in 1989 I was at the South China Morning Post, and I was editorial technology manager, and out of the blue I was asked could we produce the content of the paper in Braille, because they had the most sophisticated Braille printing in the world. And it was only because of the Tiananmen massacre that we developed programs to extract all the text out of our system after being published and transmit it across to be printed in Braille. So I became the editor of the Braille Post, and my claim to fame, I was the only editor who couldn't read his own product. Then in 2000 I was on a lot of disaster recovery committees for News Corp when I got a call from the University of Queensland that they had 10 Timorese journalists there who were doing training on reporting in post-conflict situations and the sensitivities of that. And they said they had everything, they had nothing to go back to, everything had been destroyed by the militia in Dili. And I knew that we had hundreds of computers because we were changing to Y2K. And none of these computers had a 4-digit year, they had a 2-digit. And we said, well, what the hell, doesn't matter, wind the clock back. So, cut a long story short, I flew to Dili when News Limited and various other people donated enough equipment for us to start the first paper in Dili, which I was there as production editor and became de facto production editor, arranging it from when I returned back to Brisbane to work. And this will be my 21st trip when I go back again to Dili to work with the Media Council and do a bit of training on the side for whichever newspaper.
Now, without going into too much detail on the East Timor situation, we have a fairly common development nation problem with the media there at the moment, where the proposals are effectively a move to license journalists.
Yes.
Can you just tell us why the idea of licensing journalists is a problem for free expression?
Well, all you need is the government to say, I don't like what you've written. They put pressure on the Media Council, who, if they're funded by the government, no country in the world are they not going to do that. And just the word of licensing journalists is, how do you define a journalist? You know, if you write a blog on the internet, you suddenly become a citizen journalist. Do they have to license them? It's ridiculous. And I know so many people who've got into journalism and become very good journalists without having a university degree or some sort of thing they pull out of their wallet to say, I'm a journalist.
And it's a funny thing, isn't it? Governments always want to control the media in some way, and I guess
yes.
the extreme form of control is to register and license
yes.
media practitioners.
It is, yes. And unfortunately this idea came from Portugal, and I think it dates back to the days of the dictatorship that they had under Salazar before that regime collapsed, and I think this is where the idea of licensing came from. It goes back 40 years.
Well, it shows RSF in action, this example. We've just had a letter sent by RSF to the East Timorese authorities, to the government figures there, and that has been the result of 3 of us, plus the local media council and media representatives, teaming up through visits to East Timor and on-the-ground work to develop this into an international lobby to try to oppose these measures.
Yes. Well, I know nearly all the senior journalists here and worked with them for 14 years, and the Media Council have actually asked me, will I come back and help them in this fight against the licensing law? And that's the one piece of the new legislation that's got to be hit on the head.
All right, well, it's only a short interview, and I do really thank you for your time today, Bob, and congratulations on the great work you've been doing for media freedom.
Thanks, man.